Okay, this is a little primer that I'm putting together on how to read a book in the history of science and medicine. We're going to take as an example Sarah Richardson's Sex Itself, 2014. This is a really well-organized book, and it has a lot of things that illustrate the techniques that you can use to pull out information from a history book rather quickly and easily. The first thing you want to do is look at the table of contents and look at it pretty carefully, because it will reveal a lot about the structure of the book. The first chapter is usually an introduction, and the fact that this Chapter 1 is titled with the same title as the book is a good indication that this book is going to be like that. The second chapter we're not so sure about yet, but we look at the third, and how X and Y became the sex chromosomes is obviously a historical chapter, so we can probably guess that the second chapter is also history, and maybe kind of the prehistory of the sex chromosomes as a reasonable guess. The fourth chapter looks at the current science of sex and sex chromosomes, and the next two look at each one of the sex chromosomes, the Y and the X, and then we go down to the gene level, from the chromosome down to the gene, which makes sense scientifically. Then, not so sure about what she's getting at with Chapter 8. We'll have to take a look at that. They're not all super clear, but the ninth chapter is obviously a comparative one, looking at humans versus other primates. And finally, we have the last chapter is going to contain a set of conclusions. So that gives you a pretty good idea of what how the book is going to be organized. Now, as you look, the first chapter, the introductory chapter, you're going to want to look at pretty carefully, even if you're just gutting the book to get an idea of how it's organized and what it argues. And as you look at the first chapter, you want to do things like look for thesis statements. And for example, here she says that this book examines the interaction between cultural gender norms and genetic theories of sex from the beginning of the 20th century to the present post-genomic age. So the book examines at how people look at chromosomes, particularly the sex chromosomes, X and Y. It looks at the interplay between cultural gender norms and the science, genetic theory. And it tells you the time frame that the book is going to be centered on the 20th century. Okay? Authors often will tell you what the book is about. So you want to look at these kinds of statements. As this book shows, the X and Y chromosomes, little symbols of unbreachable sex dimorphism, came to anchor a conception of sex as a biologically fixed and unalterable binary, the very conception premonitioned by Morgan's, quote, sex itself. So you want to look for these kinds of statements, as this book shows, or as I will demonstrate, things like that. Then you also want to look for lists of things. Those are often really handy, and a lot of historians will organize things. Take a concept and then list a few categories or ways that at this point is going to be demonstrated. So here we see 3 common gendered tropes feature in popular and scientific writing on the sex chromosomes. And then she tells you the first one, and on the next page she tells you the second, and then the next paragraph third. Okay, so you can get that kind of idea. Then, as you're going through the chapter, you want to scan the subheads. Those will frequently tell you outline the argument of the chapter. And if we're looking at the introduction, it's going to outline the structure of the entire book. So, for example, this one says is called the sex chromosomes. Now, this is obviously a little bit of basic biology of what the sex chromosomes are. So, if you are, say, a biology student, you may be pretty familiar with that. So maybe this is something that you can skip as you see that as you're flipping through. Okay? Aha! Here we have a subhead that is the same as the chapter and the same as the title of the book. You want to zero in on this. This is going to tell you what this book is about. Okay? What she means by sex itself. Genes and Gender, another subtitle, paraphrase of what she said the book was about early on, the first quote that we looked at. And what do you know? Here's another part of what she explained in that first quote about gender and science, cultural gender norms, and the scientific genetic theory. Okay. Now, another thing that you want to find in the first chapter, the introduction, is clues to the secondary literature that the author is drawing upon. So here she says, in the 1970s, feminist theorists such as Gayle Rubin helped to cement this layered and contextual understanding of sex. And then on the next page, the approach that I take in this book is most deeply inspired by feminist science scholarship that is documented through historically and philosophically fine-grained case studies, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so this tells you what her argument buys her at the history shop. Okay. Oh, fantastic. Here we go. At its heart, this book engages with one of the most fascinating and critical questions about science. How does the social and political context of science influence its cognitive content? Okay? In other words, how does the social context shape the scientific concepts, theories, and data, and so forth? Okay? That is one of the key statements. Here's another one, the structure of the book. Woohoo, that's great. This is going to be a fantastic shortcut for you, right? Introductions usually do something like this. At the end of the introductory chapter, you're going to look for a section that gives a synopsis of each of the following chapters in the book. Okay? Sex itself proceeds in 10 chapters. My first task in chapters 2, 3, and 4 is to unearth the origins of the concept of the sex chromosome. Okay? And that's exactly what we guessed from the table of contents. Okay? She goes on to talk about what she does in chapters 5 and 6, and 7 and 8, and 9 and 10. And we also notice that she groups the chapters in clusters of 2 or 3. Okay? And then the last section, at the end of this, after she describes the chapters, there's a little final concluding section of the introduction that typically sums up and often gives sort of an aspiration of what you hope the book is going to do. Okay? Here, I hope that this book will help in clarifying the place of genetics in our overall understanding of human sex and gender difference, and contribute to building a more gender-critical practice of genetics for the genomic age. She wants to actually improve the way the science is done and the way the public understands that science. Okay? So once you've looked at the introduction pretty carefully, you'd then go through the other chapters in a similar way, looking for argument, for evidence, for case studies that the author may use. And those are often good, and frequently if they use several case studies, if you're gutting the book, you don't necessarily need to read all of them. You will often get more out of a book if you read one of the case studies fairly carefully and then skip the other ones. Okay? Looking for primary sources and also the theoretical context of the book, the secondary sources. All right, so you go through the rest of chapters 2 through 9 that way, and then as we said, the last chapter often has takeaway messages. So this is one also you might want to read fairly carefully. You're going to get things like new synthetic language that the author is introducing to draw together the points that she's made in the book, and concepts and so forth. So this is the kind of thing that you might say if you're writing a paper that has a literature review. You might, this would be the part where you say, well, so I'm going to employ what Sarah Richardson calls sex chromosome centrism, sex-based biology, the post-genomic revival of sex difference research, the sexome, okay? All concepts and terms that she's introducing. And here, the sexome, well, what's the sexome? Here she tells you, she gives a nice list of things that provide a definition of what she means by that. Right? So the concluding chapter is often very useful for getting these kinds of synthetic ideas. And don't forget the end notes. Don't just skip over those as padding at the back end of the book. These are very important and useful for the historian. This is where historians put their data, like scientists put their data in tables and charts and so forth, and within the body of the paper. We put ours in the end notes. And so you can see, you can glean a lot of information out of the endnotes. For example, you can see the secondary literature on which the book is grounded. And sometimes you can even find a starter bibliography if you see a topic that you're particularly interested in mentioned in the body text. So, for example, early in the book, she writes, "The past decade has witnessed a wave of critical scholarship on the potential of the genome sequencing projects to resurrect dangerous notions of human difference, but the focus has been more on race than gender." Now, if you happen to be particularly interested in in things like genetic determinism and scientific racism, you might say, "Ooh, I'd like to know more about that. That's what I'm trying to research." So you flip to the end, chapter 1, note 18, and here we go. You get a nice, juicy, long footnote that lists all sorts of references, books and articles that you can then go look up and help with your own research. You can see in the also the primary sources that she uses, published sources, archival collections, interviews, meeting minutes, reports, and so forth, all different kinds of primary sources that a historian might use. Okay? So by looking at a book this way and using the front matter and end matter of the book, the notes, the table of contents, index, and so forth, and reading the chapters carefully but efficiently, skimming for footnotes and looking for particular case studies and so on, you can get the essence of a book, the argument, the primary sources used to back up that argument, and the secondary literature within which the work is embedded, in a relatively short time without having to read every single page.